And now over to Carol to introduce our next speaker.
So thank you so much, all the speakers, and Robbie for chairing it so excellently. And I think what a fantastic session that will, as you say, lightning strikes and fizzing of the static in the air. Now that's as it were, the brief talks and a huge range and very international, wonderful. Now we move on to the second part of the program, and we really have a wonderful lineup of really exceptional folk from not just Cambridge, but also largely from the south of England. I realise that it's a sort of London, perhaps sort of, well, it's the Golden Triangle rather that we've represented, but with Bath as a bit of an kind of just pulling in Bath as well. It's very affluent in Bath. But we have this marvellous array of speakers. So the first speaker this morning is Martin McKee. And I'll just give a little introduction to you, Martin. But I mean, you don't really need an introduction. You're Professor of European Public Health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and he founded the European Centre on Health of Societies in Transition, which is a WHO collaborating centre, and he's Research Director of the European Observatory on Health Systems and Policies and President of the European Public Health Association. He's basically incredibly well known for his kind of independent voice for public health and his lack of fear of talking about the secrets, the kind of the not speaking out. Martin is a wonderful example of someone who, when he feels that something is right, he will stand up and speak. Martin.
Thank you very much, Carol. Thank you. Thank you. Well, it's nice to be here, and it's also nice to have an opportunity to listen to all the superb presentations, and actually I'll be picking up some of the points that were made, or linking to some of them, although I didn't realize that I would be doing that when I prepared my thoughts today. And also I'm glad to be here to listen to my former PhD student Anna Gilmore there, and my colleagues Larry and David later. So I want to begin with a story that will be, I think, pretty familiar to you all, and it's one that we frequently use to make the case for public health. You know it all. It involves a person who's standing beside a riverbank, and first one and then another, and more people come floating down the river, drowning. And the person on the bank, who we are to understand as the traditional clinician, struggles to pull one after another out of the water. But the public health professional, on the other hand, runs upstream to find the lunatic on the bridge who is throwing all of these people in. And of course, from that we get the term the upstream determinants of health. Now, over time, we have come to understand the upstream determinants as being the social, the structural determinants of health, poverty, inequality, education, inadequate housing, and much else. And we've also come to understand how these act over the lifetime. But there's a new way of thinking emerging in public health, which thinks not just of there being a bridge with a lunatic on it who is upstream, but instead there is a set of gleaming offices. And these gleaming offices are the headquarters of the multinational corporations. Chief among them, of course, are the tobacco companies that Anna will be talking about later. These are companies that have worked for years to refine and repackage their products that explicitly do kill people, and the point was already made. These are products that kill 50% of people who use them when used as intended. But we also know that among those glittering buildings we have the headquarters of some of the food companies and the alcohol industries and the soft drink companies and others, all of which are learning from each other, all using the same PR companies, all of whom are exchanging ideas and in some cases actually owning the same products. So if we continue this analogy, we might actually think of some of these companies as actually constructing the bridges upstream, knowing that those crossing them are likely to fall off, and condemning anyone who has the temerity to call for higher building standards for the bridges or putting guardrails on the bridges as promoting a nanny state. These corporations have enormous power over the way that we live today, and the power can be seen in all sorts of aspects of our lives. The property development companies decide what types of buildings we will live in. They decide the thermal standards, the heating standards. They decide how big the rooms will be. They swing a cat around them, and as soon as they find that it hits the walls on each rotation, they know that they've just about got the right size of the room. Transport companies decide how often they will run trains and provide services. I don't know if any of you have the misfortune to travel on southern trains, maybe not in Cambridge, but if you do, you will know exactly what I mean. Other corporations decide what we eat, with a handful of large corporations controlling virtually all the brands that enter into the food supply. And then, notwithstanding the emergence of social media and the opportunity to get information from elsewhere, we have a situation where a few media corporations set the news agenda, shaping what we think. Is it any surprise that the British public voted to leave the European Union and throw out the foreigners, given what these terrible people do to us? So, given the power that they have over our lives, I'm going to argue that any attempt to understand the determinants of health and illness will be incomplete if it fails to include this issue, the issue of corporate power. But the challenges of doing so are great, and partly because it takes us into new areas of epidemiology. Now, I know that a number of you, like me, are involved in this study, The Global Burden of Disease. Carol, I think you are, and there may be many others in the room that are too. And if you are involved in this, you will have had a very busy few months over the summer as one paper after another comes into your inbox and you read through it and you comment on it. Although, of course, our task is much less than that of Chris Murray, who has had, in some cases, to deal with 2,000 or more sets of comments on an individual paper. Well, this is epidemiology on an industrial scale. The task of gathering the data is immense. The calculations involved in generating the final figures are extremely challenging, and many might say that they're heroic. The associations between the risk factors and the diseases, however, can be estimated. True, they're often not linear. They have some of the features of complexity, and they often involve interactions. Some, like tobacco, cause disease, we've already said. Others, like fruit and vegetable consumption, are protective. And of course, that is interesting because you can only have a protective effect in the presence of the exposure that is causing you harm. So that's an added level of challenge in understanding all of this. Some, and possibly all, of the physiological variables, for example, like blood pressure or sodium intake, will have a U-shaped curve or a J-shaped curve, whereas the more toxic ones, like tobacco smoke or asbestos, do not, and they have more of a linear response. So it's all very, very complicated. And of course, many of these things vary with context. Fruit and vegetable consumption, again, we've heard about, depends entirely on whether or not they are eaten fresh, or whether or not they are stewed so that any micronutrient that ever was in them has disappeared. It depends whether they're washed in clean water or in contaminated water. So you can see that it is quite complicated. But the question, I think, for this type of traditional risk factor epidemiology is it complex? Is it complex in the terms of the meaning of the term complexity? And why I think this is important is that as we move upstream, as we move to these more difficult and challenging and attenuated lines of causation, then I think we really do get into complexity. We are seeing many of the features that are often recognized as being complex. Now, of course, when we talk about complexity, when we talk about anything in a lecture, the first task is to define what we're talking about. And so, of course, inevitably, as you would expect, I would try to provide you with a definition of complexity, which is rather more difficult than it seems. Wikipedia helpfully tells us that there is no absolute definition of what complexity means. The only consensus among researchers is that there is no agreement on the specific definition of complexity. So there we have a challenge. But of course, we working in health and health systems are familiar with all of this. We know that things don't always work out in a very rational, linear way, that the system fights back. And I was reminded in preparing this talk of a paper that we wrote 21 years ago, Aileen Clark, who some of you will know, and myself, a paper in the BMJ called Guidelines, Enthusiasms, Uncertainty, and the Limits to Purchasing. And it was about one of the early NHS reforms. Yes, we have been through it before, again and again. It's like Groundhog Day sometimes in this country. And we were critiquing the introduction of the internal market, which was really when it all went wrong to begin with. And in particular, the idea that it was all simple and straightforward, and anybody who was purchasing was working in a rational market, and they could define packages of care and clinical pathways and go out and purchase them, and it would all work out fine. And there was huge enthusiasm at this time for the logic of the market. The purchaser-provider split, where we saw an idea that the prevailing vision that all interventions would be progressively evaluated by randomized controlled trials, which would then be generalizable, would apply in all circumstances. Purchasers would take comprehensive assessments of need. Purchasers would buy not activity but guidelines and protocols. And change would come through the, quote, incredibly powerful lever of contracting. Now, of course, life is more complicated, and often you don't always have all the evidence you need. And there was a drive at this time to really make it very logical. And I'm going to digress a little, but it does highlight some of the problems, because people were saying, well, we can only purchase things where there is solid evidence from randomized controlled trials, which led Jill Pell to remind us about the lack of clinical trial evidence for the use of one particular piece of equipment. This was purely, there was a lot of observational data, but that clearly might not be enough if you were going to be taking this evidence-based medicine to its logical conclusion. Anyway, we said in our paper that oversimplistic analyses are likely to be misleading, and that much of the current debate fails to recognize the complexity of healthcare. And we invoked, I think for the first time in a health services research paper, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. You can see that we were being multidisciplinary even then. And we noted that although it was 60 years old, it hadn't stopped progress in theoretical physics, but rather by explicitly recognizing the limitations and the challenges, it enabled scientists to pursue the achievable rather than the impossible. If I might digress a little bit further, you might have seen, if you are following the current debate on the British government's struggling attempts to leave the EU, the concept of Schrodinger's Brexit has been conjured, which is that you have a box in which you open Article 50 and then you wonder what's actually inside. We have no idea whatsoever. So I think some of the illusions from physics can help us with a lot of policy. Anyway, I've tried over the years to incorporate complexity theory into my empirical research, and it's clearly informed my thinking. It's been particularly helpful in thinking about health systems, for example, because we see time after time that politicians implement reforms only for the unexpected to happen. You know, things happen, and that is the problem with complex adaptive systems. You design something, it doesn't always go the way you want it to, and something comes about that you didn't anticipate. I'm in and out of this meeting. I'm on a Skype meeting in Helsinki at the minute across the way, and the Finnish government, I know somebody is here from Finland, the Finnish government seems to be doing its best to replicate the Health and Social Care Act in the UK, which is not a particularly good idea. But I think maybe that is a bit of an exception, because in fact many of us did predict exactly the mess that happened, and nobody listened to us. But anyway, the point I'm making is that when we're dealing with complex adaptive systems, things happen. They don't always go in a predictable way. And you can't just assume there will be a mechanistic link. So, how is this important for our journey upstream? Why am I talking about all of this stuff? How does it help us to understand the power of health-damaging corporations? Well, I think it helps us because if we want to confront this particular type of complexity, the complexity that arises from human systems, then we're dealing with corporations, and that's exactly what they are. So, what are complex systems? Well, first of all, they're adaptive. They react to their environment and to the other systems with which they coexist. In the case of corporations, these include systems of regulation, and we have already heard about legislation and jurisprudence and so on. Corporations can learn from experience, and they can incorporate feedback, positive or negative feedback. They're sensitive to their starting conditions, for example, what part of the world they're based in, or maybe the ethos of their founder. And these conditions may constrain how they act, functioning as what we call a strange attractor. Strange attractor is where you move around in a particular area, but you keep coming back to the same place. But that constraint in complexity theory isn't absolute, because although you may observe behavior that seems somewhat haphazard, it is constrained, but from time to time you can have a paradigm shift and you get a new attractor and things actually move quite a bit so that they start to operate in what is quite a different environment from the one that they were in before. Take the tobacco industry, which again, as I've said, Anna will be talking about later. And it has shifted markedly over time from a situation in which it was once regarded as a respectable industry. Famous entertainers would be willing to identify with it. Not nowadays. I think this would be a career suicide to do this sort of thing. And it's now moved to a situation where it is now regarded as a pariah, shunned by polite company and increasingly, fortuitously, by institutional investors. In other words, the tobacco industry has moved from being like any other corporate activity to one that is right out beyond the pale. Well, so far so good. So what does this mean for those of us in the research community? What I see is a need for us to understand how corporations interact with other systems and with their environments, looking at both how the corporations are influenced by the systems and how they in turn influence those systems. And if we're to understand that, I'm going to move on to a slightly different topic, but one that I think is crucial in understanding all of this, but central to what we're talking about today in the political economy. And that is the concept of power. Power, something that has been written out of so much of the discourse. When we look at rational actors, when we look at exchanges, when we look at a lot of economic theory, it completely dismisses the concept of differentials in power. And this is where I think we face our first challenge, because power can be exerted in three main ways. And the first involves decision-making and the control over resources. That's the sort of thing that we can observe, and we can call it visible power. But there's a second way in which power can be exerted, and that's involving backdoor machinations and influence. Now, that is also observable, but it's also hidden. Frequently, it takes place behind closed doors where we cannot observe it. But the third, which is the really difficult one, is where power is used to define the nature of the discourse, what is or is not considered possible. And often this power is so subtle that those whose thoughts and actions are constrained by it don't actually realize it. We don't realize that our thoughts and our ideas of what is possible and what is not possible have been constrained by that dominant narrative. Now, many of you will know of the concept that is called the Overton window, which defines the range of policies that are deemed as legitimate at any particular time. Now, often we think of these policies as lying on a spectrum from left to right, although there are other ways in which they can be divided up, with collective actions on the left wing and more individualistic actions on the right wing. And again, reference was made to that in one of the questions about what is politically feasible. But the window moves around, sometimes quite a lot. And in a way, we can think about this as one of as analogous to the concept of the strange attractors in complexity theory. And it, from time to time, moves to a new equilibrium. So if we look, for example, at the post-war period, we look at the policies that were being promoted by Harold Macmillan in this country, who, when he left office, said his greatest achievement was building hundreds of thousands of, not warships, not whatever, council houses. A Conservative Prime Minister in this country boasted of his achievement in building hundreds of thousands of council houses. Now, if Jeremy Corbyn was to propose doing that today, it would be seen as Marxist or radical, left-wing nonsense. So you can see the way in which these things change. Of course, a lot of it changed in the Reagan-Thatcher years. So we need to understand this is something that takes place often without us actually realizing it. Well, when we've been thinking about corporate power, we've found it helpful to think of corporate power in four ways. The first is the ability to define the narrative, what I've already said, to ensure that a problem is framed in a way that suits that particular interest. The second way is to set the rules of the game, both for their products and their services, and how, crucially, how any disputes will be resolved. The third, and arguably the most visible way in which large corporations exert power is over people and resources. determining the working conditions of those they employ or the people who supply them with goods or services. And the fourth is the power granted to them by governments to expand their property rights. We've already heard a little bit about it in the presentation about Gilead. To extend property rights far beyond the traditional idea of property as something tangible that you can see or touch. In the 1800s, you would have invested in a company that owned railway lines or it owned ships or something like that you could physically touch, to concepts of intellectual property, which have a completely different meaning. So let me give you a few examples of how we've looked at this. Corporate Europe Observatory reckons that there are about 10,000 interest groups active in Brussels, and over 1,000 of them are active in the field of health and food safety. And much of their work involves framing issues that help their sponsors. We now know an awful lot about how they operate, largely thanks to the release under court order of millions of tobacco industry documents. And again, Anna Gilmore has been absolutely heroic in this and has been one of the pioneers. So we know, for example, that the concept of the sick building syndrome was created and initially owned by the tobacco industry to ensure that symptoms of people who worked in modern office buildings or sealed office buildings, the symptoms were attributed to photocopiers or indeed anything other than tobacco smoke. And in the same way, Philip Morris created the Keep America Beautiful movement. It wanted to ensure that it owned the territory of litter control, to ensure that there would never be an independent anti-litter organization that would emerge that would notice that more than 50% of the rubbish at that time was tobacco-related rubbish, cigarette packs and butts and the like. So you can see how the corporations have sought to try to control the discourse. Now, one that we looked at, and Anna will be presenting, I'm sure, many others of these later. Some of you may be old enough to remember some of the discussions about type A behavior pattern, which described individuals who were highly competitive, ambitious, work-driven, time-conscious, and aggressive. And the concept was developed in the late 1950s by two American cardiologists, Friedman and Rosman. And they argued that it was a risk factor for coronary heart disease, which was wonderful news for the tobacco industry, because it meant that they could then portray the psychological characteristics of individuals as both a cause for them smoking and a cause of them having heart disease, therefore arguing that there was no link between smoking and heart disease. It was that people with this personality got heart disease and smoked, and the two were completely unconnected. And for many years, they spent millions on this research, but also even more money on promoting the idea. Now, independent researchers did try and replicate the data and were puzzled because they couldn't find the same relationship. They tried very hard, and eventually, over time, the idea was discarded, at least among the scientific community. But you will know that among the general public, the view that stress and psychological disorders and so on are a major cause of heart disease. There may be some link, but not in the same way that it was shown there. Another example which I was personally involved in was the exposure of the Rylander affair, l'affaire Rylander, an operation that was a closely guarded secret even within Philip Morris, with correspondence sent between the home address of the scientist concerned and the scientific director of Philip Morris, Tom Osteen. And the idea here was to initiate and to drive forward a program which was attempting to cast doubt on the link between passive smoking and health. And it did this in many different ways, including undertaking so-called confounder studies designed to identify anything that could be presented as a confounder in what we now know as a clear causal association. And what this was doing, and in the internal documents it was clear, was to create doubt, to cast doubt, to argue that relative risks were too small and all sorts of other things could be happening. Well, again, in one of the questions earlier, tobacco industry we know. What about the food industry? Well, we've been looking at it, and I'm not sure if David will be maybe not talking about it, work David Stuckler and I are doing at the minute. We're just looking at Coca-Cola. And Coca-Cola has funded the Global Energy Balance Network, a program that is seeking to distract attention away from calorie intake, and particularly from any link that obesity could have with the consumption of its own products, instead arguing that it's entirely a problem of inadequate exercise. And interestingly, because we have quite a lot of internal information here too, we can see that the tactics being used by Coca-Cola are identical to those that were used by the tobacco industry. And then, of course, there is the alcohol industry. And many of you will know that they seek to frame the health arguments in terms of reducing drunkenness, which we can all agree with. They focus on those who go out and get blind drunk and injure themselves, rather than the insidious damage that is being done to the livers of people who drink excessive amounts quietly in their own home, disturbing nobody. But sometimes the alcohol industry goes even further than this. They try to divert attention even away from drunkenness. And of course, one of the key issues here, as with the tobacco industry, is to cast the seeds of doubt, to challenge the research. Therese Marteau and I were talking earlier about the electronic cigarette, the tobacco industry with the production of electronic cigarettes, and with your work, your excellent paper that came out, I think yesterday, where the advocates, they say, well, maybe it doesn't show that, maybe this, maybe that, and so on, and find any opportunity to think of alternative explanations for what is now an overwhelming body of evidence emerging. So what did the alcohol industry do? Well, again, like the tobacco industry, takes a lot of scientists, maybe some of whom are often not particularly well known, to a nice French chateau, and looks after them very well and tells them how important they are and gets them to sign up to a statement. Now, this was the Weinberg Group. The Weinberg Group is a PR company used by Philip Morris, also used by DuPont, to rehabilitate the reputation of Agent Orange. Some of you will remember Agent Orange, a defoliant used in Vietnam that led to damage to large numbers of living people, but also unborn children, and DuPont wanted to make sure that their reputation didn't suffer as a result. And they argued that violence is a nebulous concept in this particular report. Now, that basically meant that it was a nebulous concept, and any research that was done could not be relied upon. It was almost impossible to research. So let's be clear about this. What we see is that corporations are trying to frame issues in ways that benefit them. They either want to control the research that's being done, or if they cannot, they want to stop other people doing it or discredit other people's research. And of course, sometimes they really get the lawmakers on board. The USA and the federal prohibition of the prohibition and federal funding of gun control is a classic example. You cannot use federal money to research gun control, and this is rather like the days of Galileo, when it was you're likely to be burnt at the stake for suggesting that the Earth was not at the center of the universe. But then, of course, there's another way in which corporations can control the agenda, and that is to own the media outlets. I've already mentioned a bit about the way in which our views of migrants are shaped in this country, and it works. So we know, for example, that the rollout of Fox News across the United States in the late 1990s was associated with a shift in voting behavior to the right, using an elegant piece of research that took advantage that it was on cable TV, so you could work out what towns and cities it was visible at. You could actually measure exposure. We were interested in what another one of the Murdoch outlets had done in the UK, the Sun newspaper. Again, you will be familiar with it. Famously, when it shifted support from the Conservative Party to the Labour Party in 1997, it claimed responsibility for the success of the Labour Party, and unsurprisingly, Tony Blair became the new best friend of Rupert Murdoch. Some of you will know that the relationship subsequently broke down. And if you don't know the reasons, I suggest you look it up on Google. So what did we do? Well, we used data from two large British surveys, and we wanted to try to find out how attitudes and political preferences had changed before and after the editors of The Sun had changed their mind. And the data allowed us to look at what newspapers people were reading, and we were able to show that Murdoch did indeed deliver over 500,000 more voters for Tony Blair, even though the values and the attitudes of the readers did not fundamentally change. Now, that actually wasn't enough to swing the election in 1997, but if it had been repeated, and we don't have the data, but when the newspaper changed back to the Conservatives in 2010, a shift of this size would have been enough to deny Labour another victory. The second area in which corporations seek to influence the environment in which they exist and the systems with which they interact relates to the regulatory and the related processes. And we've been particularly interested in trade liberalisation, given the prospect of major new agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership or the TTIP, which doesn't actually seem to be going anywhere at all, but anyway, it's still around. And we looked at what happened to several health-related products whenever trade became more open, when trade was liberalised, looking at measures of foreign direct investment. And we were able to show that the growth of alcohol and tobacco and energy-dense foods in low and middle-income countries increased in parallel, and the changes were not driven by increasing urbanisation or increasing income, as is often suggested, but were driven primarily by changes in foreign direct investment as a measure of opening of markets. Now, corporations also try to influence legislation, spending enormous sums on lobbyists, but does that actually work? Well, we were also interested in the tobacco industry, in the Tobacco Products Directive, and how in the European Union, and how that changed as it made its way through the original Commission proposal to legislation. And we were able to compare successive versions of the documents with two sets of other documents at either end of the spectrum, submissions from the public health community and submissions from the tobacco industry. We were able to use quantitative text analysis, and we were able to look at how the wording had changed to become more consistent with documents at either end of the spectrum. And we were able to show that at each stage there was a significant move towards the language used by the tobacco industry, which interestingly we did not find in the consultations on the sugar industry guidelines in WHO, suggesting that it was rather more immune, which is not entirely unsurprising. To go back to a point, one of the earlier presentations about litigation, we've been interested in how corporations decide how any of the arguments that they do have with governments are settled. And many of you will be aware of concerns about the investor-state dispute settlement process, which allowed tobacco companies to litigate or to take action against elected governments that were seeking to implement healthy public policies like standardized packaging. Often addressed at small countries like Uruguay, which almost gave up until it received funding from Michael Bloomberg to keep going, and then, of course, it did actually win. Well, this is an interesting one, because if you or I had a dispute with somebody else, we would go to a court presided over by a judge. But that's not good enough for corporations. They want something different. They argue that national courts cannot be trusted to be impartial, especially whenever they're challenging the national interest. But we think that there's another explanation for this. So we conducted a systematic review. Again, Anna, I hope you're not talking about this later, are you? No, good. Got lots of other things to talk about. And so we did a systematic review of cases that the tobacco industry had taken against national governments, usually on the basis of constitutional law. And in almost every case, the industry lost. Where it didn't lose the first time round, the court then provided sufficient advice to the government as to how the law could be changed so that the industry would lose the next time round. Now, given all of this, would you want to go to court? Of course not. You would want an investor-state dispute settlement process where the evidence is presented in private, where the processes are presided over not by judges on the basis of law, but by trade negotiators. If you can find trade negotiators, short supply these days, many of whom, of course, have significant competing interests. And of course, just to make it more contemporary to this audience, all of the judge-based systems are in the EU's negotiating position on TTIP. That's what the EU is pushing for. That's why the deal may not be signed. But the United Kingdom, of course, in its rush to get to the front of the queue with the Americans, will sign up to anything. So I suspect that we're going to be in the ISDS bit. But at least Liam Fox will be able to sign a bit of paper, and not, in this case, his resignation. Anyway, the third area I want to look at relates to the exploitation of workers. I'm going to cover the next 2 points relatively briefly. You're all familiar with the appalling working conditions of people in the clothing industry in Southeast Asia. We've been particularly concerned with people in the conditions in the mines in Africa, drawing on earlier work that Larry was involved in, looking at prisons in Eastern Europe. We speculated that mines were another form of institution with the added complication of high levels of HIV as well as TB. We were able to show that the mines were associated with high levels of TB and HIV, not only among the miners, but also in the communities that they migrated from. And we were able to use modeling techniques to understand the processes and to use qualitative methods to understand the relative powerlessness of the trade unions. And the point I'm making here is that this highlights the need for interdisciplinary multi-method working, because there was no single method that would give us the whole story here. We needed all of these approaches to try to understand what was really happening. Now, I'm not going to say much about my final area. It's already been covered by Victor, the issue of intellectual property. You'll be familiar with some of the most egregious examples, Indian farmers who've been growing rice all their life, basmati rice, and waking up one morning to find that the ownership of the genes are held by a company operating in Texas. We've been particularly concerned recently about the way in which the pharmaceutical industry has sought to change the rules to give it longer patent protection in relation to orphan drugs. This was a paper we had in the BMJ the other day, which the pharmaceutical industry, a bit like your problem with Gilead, Victor and Larry, the industry was not particularly amused about this in their responses. So I think we're seeing many examples of the way in which pharmaceutical companies in particular have moved from a discovery and development-based industry to one which is essentially trading intellectual property. So what I've tried to do is to set out 4 ways in which I think corporations are interacting with the environments and the systems within which they must coexist. And I'd argue that a mechanistic, rigid model in which society sets and implements rules which corporations then follow is far from reality. And we need to introduce concepts of complexity and adaptivity and nonlinear relationships. These are complex problems that can only be understood by using research methods that take account of them. But there's something else, because this research is intrinsically interdisciplinary. It draws on perspectives from epidemiology, from policy analysis, just like the selection that we heard earlier, political science, law, mathematical modeling, and much else. But the problem is that in many places, clearly not in Cambridge, but in many places, much of that research takes place in disciplinary silos. Now, when we do systematic reviews nowadays, what we've tended to do is to undertake network analyses. We include an analysis where we look at patterns of co-citation, not just what is coming out of the research, but who is reading each other's research. Where is what schools of thought are there? And what we're finding when we do this is that most people never cite literature from outside their own discipline. Now, fortunately, public health is stuck there in the middle because we do, but many other people don't. But what is the most interesting about this is not that we can do it, it's relatively easy with modern software, but when we submit these papers to journals, reviewers hate it. They absolutely hate it. They really do not. They can't see the point of including this information. They challenge it. They say, well, the paper would be much better without it, and so on. Largely because I suspect that many of the reviewers are coming from a unidisciplinary perspective, and it actually challenges the way in which they work. It's as if they really don't want to know this. So, I've covered quite a lot. Clearly, I had much more than 6 minutes. Thank you very much indeed for that. I'm not going to try to attempt to summarize what I've said, because I think there is some time for questions. But I hope that I've been able to persuade you in all of this that it is possible to look right upstream to the